Keanu Reeves had always found solace in the bustling streets of Los Angeles. Despite the chaos of his celebrity life, there was something about walking through the city's endless avenues that felt grounding. He moved through crowds, nodding to familiar faces, his mind quietly turning over the small moments of his day. Yet, his thoughts were never too far from his latest movie project or the pressures that came with being in the public eye. But on this particular afternoon, everything changed. It was a warm, typical Southern California day. The sunlight filtered through the towering buildings, casting long shadows across the sidewalks. Keanu was heading to his favorite coffee shop, taking his usual route through a side alley that led him off the main street, when something caught his eye. At first, it was just a fleeting glance, a figure hunched on the ground, surrounded by discarded newspapers and fast food wrappers. But as he got closer, his heart stopped. There, sitting against the graffiti-covered brick wall, was a face he hadn't seen in years. Mark Thompson, his childhood best friend. The guy he used to ride bikes with through the streets of Toronto, dreaming up stories of adventure and success. The guy who had been there through thick and thin during their youth. Mark had been one of the most vibrant, optimistic people Keanu had ever known. But now, here he was, disheveled, with a long beard and clothes that were stained and ragged, his once bright eyes now dull and lost. He looked like a shadow of the person Keanu remembered. Keanu stood frozen, disbelief rippling through him. He'd lost touch with Mark over the years, but he never imagined this. Not in a million years. What had happened to his friend? Without thinking, he approached cautiously, unsure of what to say. Was this really him? Was he even still the same person under all that pain? Mark. Keanu's voice came out in a breathless whisper. The figure looked up, his eyes narrowing in confusion. For a moment, there was no recognition, just a blank stare. Then, as the weight of the name hit him, Mark's face softened, and something flickered in his eyes. A trace of the old Mark, the one Keanu had known and loved like a brother. Keanu? Mark rasped, his voice barely a whisper, hoarse and full of disbelief. Is that really you? Keanu nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. Yeah, it's me. What happened to you, man? Mark didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked away, down at the cracked pavement beneath him. Keanu could see the way his friend's hands trembled, the way he seemed to shrink back from any attempt at connection. Mark had always been proud, too proud to let anyone in when things got tough. But this was different. This wasn't just a rough patch. This was something deeper, something that Keanu couldn't ignore. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of traffic and distant chatter filled the silence, but it felt like the world had paused around them. Keanu shifted uneasily, glancing around. This was not where he'd expected to find Mark. Not on the streets, not in the shadows of this city they both had called home. He wanted to do something, anything to help, but he didn't know where to begin. Mark started, his voice shaking. I didn't know where else to go. I don't have anyone anymore, Keanu. I messed everything up. I couldn't keep it together. Keanu's stomach twisted as he listened, the guilt rising in his chest. He knew Mark had been struggling in the past, but he had no idea how bad it had gotten. How had they lost touch like this? How had he missed all the signs that his friend was falling apart? But there was no time for guilt now. Keanu could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. His childhood friend was sitting right here, in front of him, on the brink of despair. And Keanu knew that whatever happened next, he couldn't just walk away. What happened to you, Mark? You were so full of life. What went wrong? Keanu asked gently, his voice full of concern. Mark's gaze flickered to the ground again, his face hardening. Life, Keanu. It's a cruel joke sometimes. You get lost, and you don't know how to find your way back. People like you, you got it easy. You have everything, fame, money. Me? I'm nothing. I lost it all. Keanu's chest tightened. The old Mark, the one who used to dream with him of making movies, had slipped away, replaced by someone broken. The anger, the bitterness, the pain. It was all there, woven into every word Mark spoke. Keanu reached out, his hand hovering over Mark's shoulder for a moment before he lowered it. The words didn't come easily. He wanted to promise him everything. Money, a place to stay, even a job, but he knew that wouldn't fix it. Not the way Mark needed. Listen, Keanu said, his voice steady. I'm not going anywhere. We're going to figure this out, okay? You're not alone in this. Mark scoffed bitterly, shaking his head. You don't get it, Keanu. You don't owe me anything. I'm nothing. Just go. Forget about me. Keanu's heart broke as he saw the defiance in Mark's eyes. But deep down, Keanu knew that if he gave up now, Mark might never have a chance to rise from this. No, Mark. I'm not going anywhere. I'm here, and I'm not going to leave you. We'll figure it out. Together. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with unspoken fears. But in that moment, Keanu made a promise to himself. He wasn't going to let his friend fall any further. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? As Keanu walked with Mark down the alleyway, the weight of the moment hung heavily between them. Mark, still wary and reluctant to show any vulnerability, kept his head down, shuffling his feet as they moved toward a nearby park bench. Keanu stayed close, giving him space but making sure he knew he wasn't going anywhere. The sounds of the city around them were muted, as if the world had slowed down just for a brief moment, allowing Keanu to reflect. He hadn't expected to find Mark like this. He thought of the countless times they'd spent together as kids, innocent, carefree, full of dreams. They had been inseparable. Keanu sat next to Mark on the park bench, a slight discomfort hanging in the air. He had so many questions, so much to say, but he didn't know where to begin. He had known Mark before everything, before the fame, before the struggles, before the collapse. They had shared everything, their hopes, their frustrations, their ambitions. But that was another lifetime ago. Mark, we used to dream about everything, Keanu said softly, as if speaking to himself as much as to Mark. We talked about making films, traveling the world. Hell, we even made up stories about being superheroes. We had it all planned out, didn't we? Mark shifted slightly, but didn't meet Keanu's gaze. His voice was rough, full of sorrow. I remember the way we used to laugh about those stupid stories, the ones where we were going to change the world. It felt like we were going to live forever, you know? Keanu nodded. He remembered it all too well. The summer days spent riding their bikes around Toronto, their favorite hangout spots, the dreams they built together while sitting on Mark's front porch late at night, talking about the future. But somewhere along the way, Mark had taken a different path. The world they had imagined together had unraveled, and Keanu hadn't even seen it coming. Then what happened, Mark? Where did you go? Keanu asked, his voice soft but insistent. You disappeared, man. I didn't hear from you. I didn't know what happened. Mark's face twisted with something Keanu couldn't quite place. Anger? Regret? You really want to know? He asked, his voice bitter. You went off and became this huge star, Keanu. I was happy for you at first, but the more I saw you on TV, the more I felt like I was nothing. Like I didn't matter anymore. I tried to keep up, tried to make something of myself, but I couldn't. I didn't have what it took. And it got to the point where I was too ashamed to even pick up the phone. Keanu listened, the pain in Mark's words settling deep in his chest. He hadn't realized how much of an impact his success had on his friend. How could he have known? They had always been equals in their friendship, never imagining that fame and fortune could change the dynamics of their bond. I wasn't trying to leave you behind, Mark, Keanu said, his voice full of regret. I never wanted to make you feel less than, but I guess I got caught up in everything. I didn't realize how much you were struggling, and that's on me. Mark's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening as he shook his head. It's not just that. I tried everything. I tried to keep going, to stay sober, to get a job. But every time I fell, it felt like the whole world was watching and waiting for me to fail. I wasn't good enough. Not for myself, and certainly not for you. Keanu felt a pang in his heart. He had never imagined Mark feeling this way, feeling so invisible, so small compared to what Keanu had become. Mark was never the type to show his vulnerability. He was always the guy with the quick joke, the infectious energy that lifted everyone around him. But now, that same person was broken, buried under the weight of his own self-doubt and addiction. I didn't see it. I didn't see you slipping away, Keanu whispered, guilt flooding him. But I'm here now, Mark. And I'm not leaving. Mark finally met his gaze. His eyes darkened with a mix of skepticism and fear. You really think you can fix me? After all this time? After everything that's happened? Keanu leaned forward, his voice unwavering. I don't know how to fix everything. I'm not a miracle worker. But I do know this. I'm not going to walk away. You're my friend, and I'm here to help. You don't have to do this alone. There was a long pause as Mark absorbed Keanu's words, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Keanu wondered if he had made a mistake. If Mark was too far gone, too deep in his own pain to believe him. But then, Mark spoke again, his voice quieter this time. You're serious, aren't you? Keanu nodded. I'm serious. We can take this one step at a time. Whatever it takes. Mark let out a shaky breath, looking away again. The hope in his eyes flickered, but it was clear that he wasn't convinced yet. Trust didn't come easy, especially when it had been broken so many times. But Keanu wasn't going to give up on him. Not now. Not after everything they had been through together. You don't have to fix me right away, Mark said after a long pause. But maybe we could start by talking. I don't know what else to do. Keanu smiled softly, feeling a small spark of relief. Talking is a good start. And so, for the first time in years, the two of them began to rebuild what had once seemed lost. One conversation, one step at a time. The following days after their unexpected reunion passed in a blur. Keanu couldn't stop thinking about Mark. The encounter had left an imprint on him, a feeling of guilt, but also a sense of responsibility. The old Keanu, the one who could do nothing more than offer a kind word and go on with his life, didn't feel like the person he was now. This was bigger than a simple act of charity. This was about helping a friend who had fallen through the cracks of life, someone who had once been his closest confidant. Keanu tried to stay in touch, reaching out to Mark regularly. At first, Mark seemed hesitant, unsure of how to respond to Keanu's offers of help. He wasn't ready to open up completely, and Keanu could see the walls he had built around himself. Mark had been hurt too many times, let down by the world, and now, even a glimmer of kindness felt like something foreign to him. Keanu knew it wasn't going to be easy, but he also knew it was the only way forward. It was early one morning when Keanu found himself sitting across from Mark at the same coffee shop they used to frequent together in their younger days. The quiet hum of the morning rush surrounded them, but the atmosphere between them was thick with unspoken words. Mark was wearing a hoodie, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, but his posture was slumped, his eyes constantly darting around as if he were still unsure of where he fit in the world. Mark, Keanu began, breaking the silence. I know you don't want to talk about it, but we need to address what happened. You can't keep running from it. It's not going to get any easier. Mark shifted uneasily in his seat, his fingers fidgeting with the sleeve of his hoodie. I don't know how to fix myself, Keanu, he muttered, avoiding eye contact. You don't understand. I've been through too much. Keanu sighed, leaning forward. Mark, I get it. I understand more than you think. But that doesn't mean it's the end. You have a chance to turn things around. We can make it work. But you need to let me in. I'm not going anywhere. Mark clenched his jaw, the muscles in his neck tightening. He shook his head. You think just by saying that, things are going to change? You think you can just swoop in and fix me? I've lost everything, Keanu. You don't know what it's like to feel like a failure. I've tried everything, and it's always been the same. People let me down. I let myself down. The words stung, each one a reminder of how deep Mark's pain ran. Keanu could see the anger and hurt in his friend's eyes, but it wasn't aimed at him. It was a lifetime of disappointment, of loss, that had accumulated into this very moment. Keanu could feel the tension rising, the unspoken resentment hanging heavy between them. It was clear that Mark wasn't ready to let go of his bitterness. Mark, I'm not here to fix you. I'm here because I care, Keanu said softly, trying to reach through the layers of defensiveness. You can't do this alone. You don't have to. You think I haven't fallen? You think I don't know what it's like to face my own demons? Mark's eyes flickered with a flash of doubt. You don't get it, Keanu. You've got it all. People love you. They look up to you. But me? I've never been enough for anyone. Not even myself. Keanu's heart broke hearing the pain in his voice. This wasn't just about addiction or homelessness. It was about self-worth, a feeling that Mark had lost along the way. And that was the hardest thing to rebuild. Mark, listen to me, Keanu urged, his voice steady, filled with quiet determination. You are enough. Don't let the world tell you otherwise. I've been lucky in a lot of ways, but that doesn't make me any more deserving of happiness or peace than you. We've both faced our battles, but you've got something in you. That fire, that spark, you still have it. I see it in you. Mark looked up at Keanu for the first time, his eyes searching, a flicker of hope battling the storm within. But it was fleeting. He looked away again, shaking his head. I don't know, Keanu. I just feel broken, like I'm never going to be whole again. Keanu took a deep breath. You can be whole again. It won't be easy, and it won't happen overnight. But you've got me, and I'm not giving up on you. I promise you that. The silence between them stretched, but Keanu didn't move, didn't leave. He stayed. The moment was fragile, and he knew he couldn't rush it. But he also knew that, despite the resistance, despite the walls Mark had built, there was a small part of his friend that still longed for connection, for redemption. And Keanu wasn't going to let that flicker of hope die. It wasn't the first time Mark had shut him out, and it wouldn't be the last. But Keanu was prepared. He wasn't just offering a hand. He was committing to being there for the long haul. It was the only way forward. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing day, Keanu noticed small changes in Mark. He wasn't cured, not by any stretch, but there was a spark, albeit faint, that hadn't been there before. The mornings were the hardest. Mark still struggled to shake off the weight of his past, to start his day without drowning in the overwhelming thoughts of his mistakes. But Keanu was there, sitting by him in the quiet moments, offering his presence, even if no words were exchanged. Keanu had come to understand that helping Mark wasn't about grand gestures or sweeping declarations. It was about patience. It was about showing up, again and again, even when it felt like progress was slow or non-existent. It was about understanding that healing was a process, not an event. One afternoon, as they sat in a small cafe, Keanu leaned back in his chair and watched Mark. He was sipping his coffee quietly, his hands still a little unsteady but his eyes clearer, less guarded. There was a calmness to him that hadn't been there before. Mark broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to thank you for this, Keanu. I don't know if I'll ever be able to make it up to you. Keanu smiled softly, his eyes meeting Mark's. You don't have to. You don't owe me anything. But I'm glad you're letting me help. You're not alone anymore, Mark. Mark gave him a weak smile, but there was an unmistakable trace of gratitude in it. The walls were still up, but they weren't as high as they had been before. But what about your career? Mark asked suddenly, his brow furrowing. What about everything you've built? You don't have time for this. You've got movies to make, places to go. Why are you wasting your time with me? Keanu's smile widened, his expression softening. Because, Mark, there's more to life than movies. More to life than the things we've built. I've learned that the hard way. People matter more than fame, more than success. Mark looked at him incredulously. You've got it all, Keanu. Everyone loves you, respects you. You've made it, man. And here I am, a mess. I don't know how to fit into your world anymore. Keanu's face grew serious. I didn't get here alone. And if you think you can't be part of my world because of where you are now, you're wrong. We all have our struggles, Mark. I've had my own demons. I'm just lucky enough to have people in my corner. I'm in your corner now. Mark's lips quivered slightly, and for a brief moment, it looked as though he might break down. Keanu watched, not out of pity, but because he understood. He understood how it felt to hide behind a facade, to act like everything was fine when inside, you were drowning. And it wasn't the fame, the accolades, or the success that had made Keanu who he was. It was the people who had loved him, the ones who had helped him through the rough patches. For a long time, Mark had pushed people away. But here, now, with Keanu beside him, he was slowly beginning to let those walls come down. "We could start small," Keanu suggested gently, bringing Mark back into the present. "You don't need to change overnight. We'll take it one day at a time. And you don't have to do it alone. We'll figure this out together." Mark nodded, his eyes still holding doubt but also something new, something resembling hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. Later that evening, after their conversation at the cafe, Keanu knew that Mark's journey was far from over. He had moments of doubt, times when he wasn't sure he could keep fighting, but Keanu could see the change. It wasn't immediate or dramatic. It was slow, but it was real. The next few days saw small victories. Mark agreed to meet with a therapist Keanu had recommended. At first, he had resisted, but slowly, he began to open up. Keanu also encouraged Mark to reconnect with some of the friends he had lost touch with over the years. It was a painful process, but Keanu stayed with him every step of the way. He wasn't going to let Mark fall back into old habits, but the road was never smooth. That Friday night, Keanu picked up the phone to find a message from Mark that left him uneasy. "Keanu, I messed up. I'm sorry. I don't know if I can keep doing this. It's too much." Keanu's stomach dropped. He knew this was coming. He had prepared himself for it. The ups and downs were part of the process. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he set the phone down and sat for a moment, reflecting. After a few minutes, Keanu dialed Mark's number. "Mark," he said when his friend picked up. "It's me. You're not in this alone. We'll figure it out, okay? I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. But you have to trust me. Trust us. You don't have to carry this alone anymore." Keanu's voice was steady, his words calm, but his heart raced. He couldn't afford to back down now, not when Mark needed him the most. There would be moments when Mark would feel like giving up, and Keanu had to be the steady hand that pulled him back from the edge. The line was silent for a long moment, but then Mark's voice broke through, strained but softer than before. I don't know if I deserve this, but okay, let's keep going." Keanu smiled softly, a sense of relief washing over him. It wasn't a perfect solution. It wasn't even a solution yet, but it was a step forward, and for now, that was enough. They both had a long way to go, but Keanu was ready. He wouldn't let his friend slip through the cracks again. The days following that call marked a new chapter in Mark's recovery. Despite his doubts and setbacks, Keanu remained a steady presence. He knew that Mark had moments of despair, times when he doubted himself, questioned if he could truly change. But Keanu wasn't going anywhere. He was committed to standing by his friend, even when the road got rough. It was a Saturday afternoon when things took a dramatic turn. Mark had agreed to meet Keanu at a park near his apartment, a place they used to visit when they were younger. Keanu was early, sitting on a bench, waiting. The air was crisp, and there was a slight chill in the wind, but it was a perfect day, a day that felt like it could be the start of something new. Keanu didn't know what would happen next, but he had an inkling that something significant was about to unfold. When Mark finally showed up, he was different. There was a weight in his eyes that Keanu hadn't seen before. Something raw, something vulnerable. As Mark sat beside him on the bench, Keanu could feel the tension in the air, a palpable sense of anticipation hanging between them. "I don't know how to say this, Keanu," Mark began, his voice shaking. "I've been keeping something from you. Something I should have told you a long time ago." Keanu looked at him, his heart beginning to race. He'd known something was off. He could feel it, but he had no idea what was coming. "What is it, Mark?" Keanu asked, his voice gentle. "Whatever it is, you don't have to keep it inside anymore. We're in this together." Mark took a deep breath, his eyes staring straight ahead, as though he couldn't bring himself to face Keanu just yet. "I've been using again. I don't know how to stop. I get so lost in my head. And it's easier, to just drown it out." Keanu felt his chest tighten, his heart sinking as the words hit him like a blow. He had suspected that Mark was struggling, but hearing it out loud, hearing the admission of weakness, it shook him to the core. He wasn't angry. He wasn't disappointed. He was devastated for his friend, knowing that this moment was one of reckoning. But Keanu also knew it wasn't the end. "Mark," Keanu said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "This is hard, but it's not the end of the road. You can stop. You can get help. You don't have to face this alone." Mark's eyes filled with tears, but he quickly wiped them away, his voice cracking. "I don't know if I can. I don't know if I have it in me anymore." Keanu's heart hurt seeing his friend so broken, so defeated. He had hoped for a breakthrough, but hearing Mark confess this kind of struggle, it felt like the weight of the world had settled on his shoulders. He wanted to say something that would make it better, something that would make it go away, but he knew it wasn't that simple. This was Mark's battle, one he had to fight for himself. "You do have it in you, Mark," Keanu said firmly, his gaze never leaving his friend's face. "I know it doesn't feel like it now, but you do. I've seen you at your best, and I know that person is still there, deep inside. You can't give up. Not now. Not ever." Mark shook his head, his voice low, almost a whisper. "I've lost too much, Keanu. Too many chances. Too many people. I've let everyone down." Keanu reached out, placing a hand on Mark's shoulder, his touch steady and reassuring. "You haven't lost everything, Mark. You still have me, and I'm not going anywhere. You haven't let me down. You haven't let yourself down. Not yet." For the first time in a long while, Mark looked up at Keanu, his eyes searching. There was something different in them now, something like a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Keanu believe that this moment, this conversation, could be a turning point. "I don't deserve you, Keanu," Mark murmured, the tears welling up again. "But I want to try. I want to get better." Keanu nodded, his throat tight. "That's all I'm asking. Take it one step at a time. We'll get through this together." The weight that had been pressing on Keanu's chest began to lift, but only slightly. There was still a long road ahead, and the battle wasn't over. But in that moment, Keanu knew something had shifted in Mark. It wasn't the kind of breakthrough where everything was suddenly perfect, but it was the beginning of something. Something real. "Just promise me you won't give up," Keanu said, his voice a little shaky now. "I know it's hard. I know you feel like you can't do it, but you can. I'm here. We're in this together. You're not alone." Mark nodded, his hand trembling slightly as he placed it on Keanu's. "I won't give up. Not as long as I've got you." They sat there in silence for a few moments, the weight of the conversation hanging between them, but also a sense of hope. A small, fragile hope that could grow if nurtured. The kind of hope that only came after hitting rock bottom. Keanu could feel it, the turning point. He knew they weren't out of the woods yet, but this was the start of something new. The weeks that followed were a testament to how far Mark had come. Though it wasn't without its difficulties, there were relapses, emotional breakdowns, and moments when the weight of his past seemed almost too much to bear. Keanu's presence was a constant. Mark wasn't alone anymore. Keanu had shown him that healing wasn't a race. It was about progress, no matter how slow, no matter how painful. One evening, Keanu invited Mark to his home. It wasn't anything fancy, just a quiet dinner in the living room, but it was a moment for them to sit down and reflect on how far they'd both come. The atmosphere was calm, the air filled with the faint smell of home-cooked food, and the only sounds were the soft hum of the city outside and the occasional clink of silverware. Keanu made a point to turn off his phone for the night, focusing entirely on the dinner. He knew that these quiet moments, these simple gestures, meant more than any grand gesture could. Mark looked around Keanu's living room, taking it all in. The space was cozy, lived in, but there was something about it that felt peaceful. It was the kind of space you could imagine healing in, slowly and gently, just like the friendship that had been reformed between them. "Man, this is nice," Mark said as he sat down at the table, his eyes taking in the surroundings. "I don't know what I expected, but it's not like I thought. It's not, like a movie set or something." Keanu chuckled, shaking his head. "No, this is real life, Mark. It's where we find peace." They ate in comfortable silence for a while, but Keanu could feel the heaviness between them begin to lift, piece by piece. They were no longer just two friends who had lost touch. They were two people rebuilding, starting again. And that was a feeling neither of them had expected, but both of them had desperately needed. After dinner, Keanu set the dishes aside and poured them both glasses of whiskey. It was a celebratory gesture, but it wasn't the kind of celebration that came with fireworks or confetti. This celebration was quieter. It was the kind that came with knowing that you had fought hard for something and had come out of it stronger. To new beginnings, Keanu said, raising his glass. Mark's hand trembled slightly as he lifted his own glass, his voice thick with emotion. To not giving up, to finding the strength to keep going, even when you feel like you can't. The two of them clinked their glasses, and Keanu could see it, the subtle shift in Mark. It wasn't just gratitude. It was a deep understanding that things weren't perfect yet, that the journey ahead was still long and filled with obstacles. But for the first time in years, Mark believed he could make it through. Keanu set his glass down, his eyes meeting Mark's. You've come a long way. But this is only the beginning, Mark. And you've got it in you to keep moving forward. Mark nodded, his expression serious. I don't know if I could have done it without you, Keanu. You've been there for me in ways I never expected. You've shown me what it means to not give up on someone. Keanu smiled softly, his gaze unwavering. You're not alone, Mark. Not now, not ever. I'm proud of you. And I know that you're going to get through this. We'll get through it together. Mark's eyes shone with unshed tears, but there was something different about them. It wasn't just sadness or despair. It was relief. It was the kind of relief that came when you finally felt the weight of the world start to lift. Mark wasn't the same man who had first walked into Keanu's life. He was someone else now, someone stronger, more determined, someone who still had a long road ahead of him, but had finally found the courage to walk it. And Keanu knew that, too. He understood the significance of the moment, the understanding that even though the hard part was over, the hard work was just beginning. They would continue to fight for their futures, one day at a time. As the evening went on, they talked about everything and nothing. About the movies, about their past, about what the future might hold. But no matter what they talked about, Keanu knew that this was a turning point. For both of them, when Mark finally stood to leave, he paused in the doorway, looking back at Keanu. I don't know how to thank you, Keanu. I really don't. But I promise you this, I'm not going to give up. Not again. Keanu's heart swelled with pride. You don't have to thank me, Mark. You've done the hard part. You've taken the first steps. And that's what matters. Mark smiled faintly, his eyes glistening with something more than gratitude. It was hope. It was the kind of hope that only came when you truly believed in something, or someone, again. As Mark left and the door clicked shut behind him, Keanu stood there for a moment, his thoughts drifting. He wasn't just proud of Mark. He was proud of the journey they had both taken together. And as the world outside continued to spin, Keanu knew this was one of the most meaningful things he had ever done. To help a friend rise from the ashes of their past, to show them that redemption was possible, was more than just a personal victory. It was a triumph of human connection. Keanu took a deep breath, staring out the window at the quiet night. There was still work to be done, but he was ready for it. Because sometimes, the most beautiful part of life wasn't the destination. It was the journey. And he had the honor of walking it with his friend. It had been a few months since that pivotal dinner, and both Keanu and Mark had made strides in their personal journeys. Mark had enrolled in rehab, a decision that felt like the first real step he'd taken toward healing. He still had his bad days, days when the demons of his past resurfaced and threatened to drag him down. But he no longer felt like he was fighting alone. Keanu was there, just as he had promised, ready to catch him whenever he stumbled. Keanu watched his friend's transformation with a quiet pride, though he was always careful to let Mark lead the way. This wasn't Keanu's fight. It was Mark's. Keanu had learned the hard way that sometimes, the best way to help someone was to give them the space to help themselves. Mark had begun to rebuild his life slowly but surely. He found a job at a local bookstore, which wasn't much, but it gave him a sense of purpose. Every morning, he woke up with a goal. Every evening, he came home knowing he had done something meaningful, no matter how small it seemed. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real, and it was enough for him, for now. Keanu, on the other hand, had started to find a new rhythm in his own life, too. With Mark on the path to recovery, Keanu had more time to focus on his own passions again. He had always loved photography, a hobby that had fallen by the wayside in recent years. But now, he was picking up his camera again, capturing the world around him in a way that reminded him of who he was before everything became so complicated. One afternoon, Keanu called Mark and invited him to a local art exhibit that featured photographs of people overcoming adversity. Keanu had submitted a few of his own photos, but what mattered more to him was that he and Mark were taking another step together, this time, not as the person who was always rescuing, but as two individuals moving forward side by side. When Mark arrived at the exhibit, he looked different. There was a new confidence in his step, a lightness in his expression that hadn't been there before. Keanu couldn't help but notice it. Mark wasn't the same man who had stumbled through life with a broken heart and a fractured mind. He was becoming someone else, someone he could be proud of. "This is amazing," Mark said, taking in the photos displayed on the walls. "I didn't think I'd ever be able to appreciate art like this. I used to think it was all just for people who had their lives together." Keanu smiled, feeling the weight of those words. Sometimes, the best art comes from pain. It's the way we express our struggles, our journey through the darkness. They walked through the gallery, talking about each piece, each story. It was a healing moment, not just for Mark, but for both of them. As they neared Keanu's photographs, Mark stopped in front of one of them, a black and white image of a man standing on the edge of a cliff, staring into the vast unknown. The emotion in the photo was raw, the uncertainty of the man's future captured in every line of his face, every curve of his body. Keanu hadn't realized it, but the photo was a reflection of himself, a representation of the time when he had wondered what would come next. He had never thought much about the meaning behind it, but now, standing there with Mark, he realized how much it symbolized their journey. "I like this one," Mark said softly, his voice filled with quiet reverence. "It's like the man standing at a crossroads, but there's hope in the way he's looking out at the horizon. Like no matter how hard it gets, there's something to keep moving toward." Keanu's throat tightened as he nodded. "Yeah, that's what I was thinking when I took it. That no matter how dark it gets, there's always something ahead. A chance to start over." Mark turned to him, his eyes steady, his voice firm. "I'm starting over, Keanu. It's slow, but it's happening. And I wouldn't have made it this far without you." The words hit Keanu hard, not because they were unexpected, but because they were exactly what he needed to hear. They had both come so far, and there was still so much more ahead, but hearing Mark say it, hearing him take ownership of his recovery, of his life, was more than Keanu could have hoped for. "You've made it this far on your own, Mark," Keanu said, his voice full of admiration. "I just gave you a little push. The rest is all you." Mark smiled, a genuine smile, full of gratitude and recognition. "Maybe, but you were the one who showed me that I was worth fighting for. You helped me believe in myself again." Keanu reached over and gave Mark a friendly shoulder bump. "Well, that's the easy part. The hard part is showing up every day. You've done that. You're doing that." They stood there for a moment, two friends who had been through hell and back. But now, for the first time in a long while, they were standing on solid ground. Not just physically, but emotionally. Their bond was unshakable now, forged in the fire of their shared experiences. Later that evening, as they left the gallery, Keanu couldn't help but feel a sense of peace wash over him. They were still both works in progress, still finding their way through life's labyrinth. But they were no longer lost. They had found their path, and they would keep walking it, together. Keanu turned to Mark, his smile gentle but knowing. "This is just the beginning. The future's out there, and it's ours to make. We've got this, Mark." Mark nodded, the weight of everything they had been through settling into a quiet understanding between them. "Yeah, we do." And as the two of them walked off into the night, Keanu realized that, in a way, they were both standing at that same crossroads, looking out into the unknown, but no longer afraid. The horizon stretched before them, full of possibilities. And for the first time in a long while, Keanu felt certain that whatever came next, they would face it together. Months passed since that quiet evening at the art exhibit. Mark's recovery journey was far from over, but it was beginning to feel like a real possibility. His days were still a mix of ups and downs, but more often than not, he found himself on the upswing. It had been 6 months since he'd gotten his life back on track, and Keanu continued to be his anchor, guiding him when things felt shaky and celebrating the small victories when Mark could finally see the light in places he once thought dark forever. Keanu, for his part, had thrown himself into his own projects, rediscovering his love for photography and art. He had been busy with several exhibitions, and although the work was fulfilling, he never forgot the promise he had made to Mark. He wasn't about to let his friend slip back into the shadows. It was early spring, and the city was beginning to warm up. The world outside felt more alive, full of color and energy. Mark had just finished a 12-hour shift at the bookstore when Keanu called, asking if he wanted to meet up. "You sure you're not too tired?" Keanu asked, already knowing the answer. Mark let out a small laugh. "Honestly, I'm tired, but I could use some fresh air." "What's up? How about a walk in the park?" "I've got something I want to show you," Keanu replied, his voice filled with excitement. Mark agreed, and the two of them met at a nearby park. It wasn't anything special, a simple green space in the heart of the city, but to Keanu, it felt like the perfect place for their next step together. When Mark arrived, he saw Keanu sitting on a bench, looking out at the people enjoying the sunshine, their laughter blending with the chirping of birds. It was a peaceful scene, one that felt worlds apart from the chaos they had both come from. Keanu waved as Mark approached. "You've been busy," Mark remarked, noticing the slight exhaustion in Keanu's eyes. "Yeah, but it's a good kind of busy," Keanu said with a grin. "I've been working on a new project, and I think you're going to like it." They began walking through the park, taking in the sights and sounds of the spring day. Keanu led Mark to a small pond surrounded by blooming flowers and trees, where a few ducks paddled lazily through the water. The scene was serene, and Mark couldn't help but appreciate the quiet beauty of it all. "What are we doing here, man?" Mark asked, a bit confused but intrigued. Keanu smiled. "I've been working on something, a little photo series, and I wanted you to be part of it." Mark raised an eyebrow. "A photo series? Of what?" Keanu turned to him with a knowing look in his eyes. "Of you." Mark blinked. "Me? What are you talking about?" "Listen," Keanu began, his tone serious but filled with warmth. "You've been through a lot, and you're not just recovering. You're growing. You're becoming someone I didn't think I'd ever see again, and I think the world should see it too. I've been documenting people overcoming their struggles, showing the strength it takes to move forward. And I want you to be one of those people in my photos." Mark didn't speak at first. He felt a wave of emotion crash over him. It wasn't just the idea of being in the spotlight. It was the realization that Keanu saw him as something more than just a broken person. He saw him as someone capable of greatness, even after everything that had happened. "You really think I'm ready for something like that?" Mark asked, his voice soft, almost hesitant. Keanu nodded. "I've watched you work for this, Mark, and now I want you to see yourself the way I see you. You've earned it." Mark felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't thought of himself as anything special in a long time. But the way Keanu spoke about him, it made him feel like maybe, just maybe, he had something to offer the world after all. "I don't know what to say," Mark admitted, his voice catching. "You don't have to say anything," Keanu replied. "Just trust me, and let's make something beautiful together." Mark nodded, wiping a stray tear from his eye. "Okay, let's do it." Keanu raised his camera, and they spent the next few hours taking photos, capturing moments of Mark in the park. It wasn't about perfection or posing. It was about authenticity. The photos captured Mark's raw emotion, his struggles, and most importantly, his strength. There was no pretense in the way Keanu took his pictures. Every shot was a testament to the man Mark was becoming, to the friend who had stood by him when everything seemed lost. At one point, Keanu asked Mark to sit on a bench by the water, his face soft in the golden light of the late afternoon. The moment felt timeless, as though it would be captured forever in the frame. Mark looked down at the water for a moment, lost in thought, before turning to Keanu with a quiet smile. "You're right," Mark said, his voice steady now. "I didn't think I was ready for this, but I am." Keanu lowered the camera, looking at Mark with pride. You've always been ready, Mark. You just needed to believe in yourself. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow across the park, Keanu and Mark walked back to the bench where they had started, sitting in comfortable silence. There was no need for words anymore. They both knew how far they had come, and how much further they still had to go. Mark's journey was far from over, but now, for the first time, he didn't feel like he was walking it alone. And Keanu, standing beside him, knew that they had both found something far more precious than any photograph. They had found a future. It had been nearly a year since that day in the park when Keanu had asked Mark to be part of his photo series. Mark had come a long way since then, and so had Keanu. Their lives, once defined by confusion, pain, and uncertainty, had taken on a new meaning. The journey wasn't over, far from it, but it had evolved into something both men could be proud of. Mark had settled into his new life. His job at the bookstore had led to new opportunities, and he was now managing the store's operations. He had found a small apartment in a quieter part of town, far from the chaos of his past. It wasn't much, but it was his, and it felt like home. He continued his therapy sessions and worked every day to maintain the fragile but steady foundation he had built for himself. There were still bad days, still moments where the old shadows crept back in, but now, he had the tools to face them head-on. Keanu had stayed busy with his photography, continuing to document the stories of people who overcame their struggles, just like Mark. His photos were being featured in galleries across the country, and he had even started working on a book, combining his photos with the stories of the people who had inspired him. But despite his professional success, Keanu had never lost sight of the most important thing in his life, his friendship with Mark. Mark's transformation was the heart of Keanu's project. His journey had been the one that inspired the book, and his image, captured in that now famous photo at the park, was the cornerstone of the entire series. It was more than just a photograph to Keanu. It was a symbol of resilience, of the power to rise from the ashes, and most importantly, of the enduring bond between two people who had once been lost but had found their way back to each other. One evening, Keanu invited Mark to his latest exhibition, which was being held at a new gallery in the heart of the city. The exhibit was a culmination of a year's worth of work, a tribute to the people who had found their way through the darkness. As they walked through the gallery, Mark's eyes darted from photo to photo, each one telling a story of struggle, survival, and strength. But when they reached the center of the room, Mark's gaze landed on the large print of himself. The photo was framed in stark black and white, a dramatic shot of Mark sitting by the pond in the park, his face open, vulnerable, yet full of quiet strength. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, as if contemplating the road ahead, the unknown path that stretched before him. It was a moment frozen in time, one that represented everything Mark had been through, and everything he still had left to face. Mark stood there for a moment, taking it all in. The photo wasn't just a picture. It was a reflection of the man he was now, a man who had fought to find himself again. He swallowed hard, his throat tight. He had never thought of himself as someone worthy of being in an art gallery, but here he was, immortalized in a way that made him feel proud, not just of the photo, but of the person he had become. Keanu, who had been standing beside him, quietly observed Mark's reaction. He could see the mixture of emotions in his friend's face: pride, disbelief, and a hint of something deeper, something almost spiritual. It was the feeling of closure, of redemption. "You okay?" Keanu asked, his voice gentle. Mark turned to him, his eyes glistening with tears. "I can't believe it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I never thought I'd see myself like this, but I feel like I'm finally who I was meant to be. This photo, it's more than just me. It's everything I've been through." Keanu smiled, a knowing look in his eyes. "It's you, Mark. All of you. The broken parts, the healed parts, the parts that are still finding their way. I hope you can see what I see, the man you've become." Mark nodded slowly, feeling the weight of Keanu's words. He could see it now. The photo wasn't just a symbol of struggle. It was a symbol of survival, of growth, of hope. And as he stood there, looking at the image of himself, he realized that the journey was still far from over. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel lost. He felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. As they continued to walk through the exhibit, Mark noticed the reactions of the other visitors. People were stopping in front of his photo, discussing it in hushed tones, their expressions thoughtful. He realized that, in a way, his story was no longer just his own. It had become a part of something much bigger. He had shared his pain, his healing, and now, it was inspiring others. Later that night, after the exhibit had wrapped up, Keanu and Mark sat outside the gallery on a bench, just like they had so many months ago in the park. The city lights flickered around them, and the soft hum of traffic filled the background. Keanu glanced at his friend, a grin spreading across his face. "You did it. You're here." Mark chuckled, shaking his head in disbelief. "Yeah, I guess I am." He paused for a moment, his smile fading into something more contemplative. "I don't think I could have gotten here without you, Keanu. You were there when I had nothing left to give. You saw me at my worst and helped me find my way back. And I don't think I'll ever be able to thank you enough for that." Keanu turned to him, his expression sincere. "You did all the hard work, Mark. I just gave you a little push. The rest was all you. You've been the one showing up every day, even when it felt like it wasn't worth it." Mark smiled, his eyes shining. "Maybe. But I wouldn't have even known how to start if you hadn't shown me that I could." They sat in silence for a few moments, both men content in the knowledge that their bond had been forged through hardship but strengthened through love and trust. As Mark looked out at the city, he realized something profound. The road ahead would always have its challenges. There would be days when he stumbled, when the old wounds threatened to reopen. But he also knew, with complete certainty, that he was no longer walking that road alone. And for the first time in his life, he was ready to face whatever came next. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?